A new season brought forth by a new year. What new dangers, what new knowledges, what discoveries, and what stories will we uncover? For all of these and more can be found here at the Lair of OmnusI in this, our third season. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Happy Halloween. I am OmnusI, here in my lair. Today I'm going to have a special Halloween episode of the Lair of OmnusI for you. We're going to talk about a few things related to horror, and sorting through what is horror and what can possibly be made for games that are seemingly horrific to make them into true horror. So, happy Halloween, sit back, and let's get started. So, horror. Horror, I've gone on record to say that it is the most difficult genre of role-playing game to run, especially if it's not something that you really specialize in. You see, horror involves a number of things to really make it stick, and there are various genres to horror, some more effective than others. For instance, even a standard fantasy game can turn horrific if you insert certain elements into it that prey upon the mind of the people who are playing, and we're going to go away from things that are just outright offensive to shock people, because that's honestly the lowest form of horror, and it may lose you some friends and players very quickly. So, having horrific things that could only really be resolved in ways that are expressly immoral, or something that goes possibly against the personal codes and safety levels of the players attending, that's just out of bounds, or it should be. I know some people like to push those kind of boundaries, but anything that involves horrifically doing something or taking control of another person's character that's going to leave a lasting mark, I would say is out of bounds, especially if it's just for a Halloween session in the middle of an ongoing campaign. Some people don't want their characters to be assaulted in ways that might actually bring up either bad memories if they have any previous experience, or ones that leave lasting impact on a character such that they might be driven off from the game after this. So I would say, for example, any kind of adult situation, assault, there's so many other ways that you can achieve horror without going into something like that. Mind control and taking possession of other characters you should be very careful with something like that. Now, I am aware that there are games, some that actually do horror, that is an intrinsic part of the game. But in that, it's a mechanic. You kind of signed up for that from the get-go, and there may be ways to head things like that off. I'm talking, for instance, of games like Vampire the Masquerade, where part of the horror of the game is your character has this inner beast that always wants to be satisfied. And if something triggers you, for instance, exposure to a deadly threat, even, fire is so deadly to vampires, even lighting a cigarette might be enough to awaken the beast in terror of the flame. Or an insult, something that your average person would get grumpy, get a bit miffed, maybe get genuinely angry to a vampire, might send them into a frenzy to attack you, or to, if they're sure they can't beat you, to leave the area immediately outside of their control. You kind of understand that being a vampire is about being cool. It's about looking good, or it's about being totally badass, or something like that. But when it comes down to it, the personal elements of the game largely revolve around the fact that your character has unnatural hungers and tendencies that may push them outside of the control of you as the player. And that's kind of horrible. And Werewolf has the same thing with rage. You may actually fall into your rage and go berserk, and then you become a whirling engine of destruction. Friend nor foe matters, you just want to destroy. That's certainly a possibility. So, yes, there's games that do use that, but in a game like, say, Dungeons and Dragons, just nakedly controlling a character for the sake of horror, that ceases to be fun and moves into areas of real concern for a lot of people. I myself would seriously have some issues if the game master just out of hand took control of my character to use them as they saw fit. It's tainting the pool a little bit there. So things like that should be stayed away from. And my games, it's fairly clear, and I don't have to state it, I don't think, generally, but since sexual content isn't on board, no kind of assault in that nature is ever going to be in any of my games, even if it's horror. That's just, there's too many other avenues that you can approach with horror without having to go to that level, which, again, will seriously offend some people, so that's not a level I feel comfortable with either. Even if such are either implied or possibly even shown on the screen in some horror movies, those are oftentimes in just bad taste. And a psychological thriller that kind of lends in that degree, well, some people might enjoy that, but it's nothing you'll ever see in one of my games. Now, of course, if you have the express permission of your players to run something like that, I'm not going to tell you how to have fun with them. You do you, and as long as everyone has fun and nobody's made unduly uncomfortable, then you're probably fine. But be aware of boundaries. In horror, it's fine to shock. It's fine to get your players emotionally invested in something, but crossing those boundaries is never okay, even in the sake of a horror game, because it's still just a game and it's played for entertainment, not to inflict emotional damage or anything like that. So, boundaries, always remember those for horror. Now, there are games that seem like they dovetail well in horror. For instance, Mork Borg, which I've recently acquired and reviewed, is certainly one of those games. It seems like it's an awful place with many unfortunate circumstances that can come about to the people who dwell there, including the player characters, of course. But I find that it's actually a pretty poor effort at horror for a few reasons. Number one, there's something that's unreal about Mork Borg. It's not Earth. It doesn't pretend to be. It's a place that's about as low on the scale of fantasy that you can get. It's got strange circumstances and strange peoples who seem threatening and intimidating. It seems like everything is horrible in the world, even if perhaps you might have player characters that may try to make something better of themselves, or people who on their face value look like they're pleasant or good. It just turns out that they're never going to be in that game. Or if they are, then that's feeding into something horrible in its turn. So the idea in Mork Borg, for instance, of actual horror really doesn't come across well in how it's portrayed. True, horrible things can happen to your characters, and probably should. By the mechanics of the game, gruesome critical hits and an over-reliance on combat, since many of the threats just want to eat your eyeballs out, you're going to have to resort to things that are going to expose your characters to violence, and probably fairly graphic violence at that. If you're kind of fitting in with the feel of the game, it's going to be luridly pointed out that you are going to encounter terrible things. But there's a few things that block that from being really horror and more edgy fantasy. In terms of horror, and I've said this before, you need to have something that you care about. For a horror movie to work, if there's nothing to be lost, and you're just watching people have horrible fates that are played out in front of you, you see bodies dismembered and heads go flying and buckets of blood and viscera. You see dead things that just look horrific, maybe zombies or what have you. If it's just that, It's shock, which is an aspect of horror, sure. But the problem is it's very easy to get jaded to this. You can, unless you have a really, sensitive disposition, eventually get to a point where, oh, it's just another dead body. It's just another zombie. And it doesn't take much for a person to get used to something like that, where it loses its value to shock. I know any number of people who can unflinchingly watch a good shock horror movie, and it's just like, okay, well, the effects were nice, but it's easy to lose that. However, the surefire way to horror is to get the players to be invested in something that you hold up as good and valuable. If you threaten something or someone that the players intrinsically want to protect, you will find that horror has vastly more impact. If the players themselves see something, a wrong perhaps, or maybe somebody who's threatened, somebody who's been kidnapped or in distress because something is going to happen, if the players can attach any significance to those characters, to that thing, it implies that it's going to have an effect on them if they fail. And if the event can be changed at all and they don't try to change the event, they just, oh well, she got kidnapped. Lots of kids get kidnapped. Then you've really lost the whole lead into horror. It shouldn't be something that the players can just brush off. You need to put some personal investment into it. Now, if you're going to do a one-shot horror, that's the hardest because you've never had time to develop any of those feelings. But if you're running an ongoing campaign, if I'm running something in horror, like vampire, like werewolf, one of the first things I would do is put things in place the players can grow to care about. Somebody who showed them some kindness, somebody who helped them out, somebody who you can hold up as an exemplar for them. And then threaten to tear it down, threaten to destroy it, threaten to taint it, threaten something. And then you have your inroads into horror. And I think just too many of these slasher films and shock movies, they lose that. And they can be pointed as, oh, that's just shock. Okay, you showed me another dead body, you showed me another gruesome decapitation or disembowelment or something. You move on. But the best ones show you a person who you can possibly relate to. Relating to somebody is a good inroads to forming a bond to them. But even if you can't relate to them, then at least find something good that you would like to see preserved. And in something like vampire, even though the characters are vampires, they're usually pretty low on the totem pole. So if you give them a mentor, you give them a figure who advocates for them, you can form an attachment. Especially if that person seems like they're operating not out of strength, because you want them to be vulnerable, but operating out of a sense of moral decency that others respect. Now all of a sudden, maybe they get curious. Why is this person who doesn't really know us, why did they go before the prince and say, no, you can't just destroy them? And they argued for us. And even though they themselves are not an elder, they're not one of the primogen of the city, they still are a good person who would stand up before an uncaring prince or a brutal dictator and say, you should not do this. This is wrong, and they should be allowed a chance. Now all of a sudden the players have somebody to attach some significance to. Now if you want to turn into true horror, now you can threaten them. Or even worse, if the players are pushed into a frenzy, for instance, and they lose control of the characters for a second, and when they come to, this person who advocated for them was the target of their anger, the target of the beast. If they're destroyed, it could be a shocking moment, a horrifying moment, because you built the character up a little bit, and you used the character's license to take that away and inflict harm in a way that has meaning to the characters. if you go through an embrace in Vampire and you narrate how the character, say, they go to their girlfriend soon after becoming a vampire, not knowing anything, just having these hungers. They go to their girlfriend and they lose control and they end up killing their girlfriend or boyfriend, whatever. That has a little bit of an impact because we've heard of stories like that. We can kind of relate to that circumstance. But until you've built up that character, it's not going to have nearly as much of an impact. But you do have nice background saying this person may dread intimacy now that they're a vampire because they're afraid they're going to hurt the person that they care for. They don't want to see that ever happen again. Seems to make good sense and could work out as a point for your character, but it's really kind of falls off of horror. Building that bond becomes supremely important. Now, if you are just doing a one-shot, you can, of course, kind of fill in the blanks. It won't be as impactful if you have an ongoing campaign to build up that horror, but you can, of course, say, this person has this relationship, you already have that. If you do that, say you're going to run a vampire game at a con, just using this as an example, and the character that's going to be imperiled, well, let's go away from vampire. Let's say, Dungeons and Dragons. You have a princess who's going to be captured. Okay, fair. Before I would have them just have stated, oh, the princess has been captured and you must go and rescue her. Have them meet with the princess first. Have them see that she's a good and decent person. She's not a spoiled noble, but she's a person who empathizes with people. Go with the Disney princess effect. All the Disney princesses, even if they have some character flaw, they're generally good people. They are genuinely people that the audience should relate to because at their core, they're decent people that you don't want to see something bad happen to. In Aladdin, you don't want to see Jasmine marry Jafar. That would be the horrible. That would be the end. That would be a terrible fate for her. In The Little Mermaid, you don't want to see Ursula's wrath come down on Ariel. You're kind of you're rooting for her, despite the fact that she is horribly inexperienced. She's means well. She's a basically good person. You have elements like that we have examples of. It's good to learn from that. Make the target sympathetic and have at least a small amount of role play before you break into the what's going to happen, what terrible thing do we need to avoid. And that can be a wonderful tool, especially if time is short and you have to... Alright, you're going to help me make a video, are you? Alright. Happy? Good. This is Magic, of course. She wants to be in the video. So, making somebody sympathetic has them basically almost always graphically showing examples of the traits that you want the players to sympathize with. If you want that to be cuteness, make them cute. If you want them to be warm and embracing, demonstrate that. But if you're going to build sympathy in a character, you have to show, not tell. And oftentimes, if you have only, say, a 4-hour window to run a game, spending 15 minutes of it building up the targets of your sympathies is well worth it. Organizing and engineering the situation for that to be demonstrated is, I believe, one of the keys that multiplies the effectiveness of all of the horror. And if you have something fairly dark, like the princess gets captured by a cult of Asmodeus, and they're prepared to do terrible things, sacrifice her on an altar or something like that. Everything you do from that point on, from showing the derangement of the cultists around the Asmodean cult, showing all the horrific trappings of devil worship, yes, I love you too. Showing how cuddly the kitties are. Showing the fell nature of the demons and things that they're in truck with is magnified. Because now you're imagining all of those things. That poor target of whatever bad could happen if the players can't avert it, demonstrated there in front of you. So that can be a very effective way to go into horror. It's especially important in horror than any other genre, I believe. Show, don't just tell. And, it's an inescapable fact that if your players lose that connection, they lose any sense of caring about another faceless target to be rescued, you lose almost all of the horror factor in it, outside of what you can gain from shock and gore and scary imagery and things like that. So, that's possibly one of the most important things, I would say, for anybody who's contemplating a scenario involving horror. Now, all the other trappings and everything else I've mentioned in other Halloween and horror-based episodes does apply. And it applies across any genre or any game system, quite honestly. So if you're running Mork Borg, which I've just said is not inherently a great game for horror, there are elements that you can pluck on by following those examples. For instance, everything in Mork Borg is horrible, okay? There are some people who seem good and seem to have good intentions, but it's all really horrible. It's implied that those good intentions are going to be turned for dark purposes. It's all just a trap, even if it seems nice. And figures that we often associate with being a good counselor. I mean, the Church of the Two-Headed Basilisks, there's not a lot of nice in there. They may be prophesying and foretelling the future, but it's not a good future, and they certainly don't have our best interests at heart. So then you can look at the governance of various places and hope that they have the best interests at heart of the people that they govern over, but that just simply isn't really the case ever. Now, how can you fix that without actually changing Mork Borg itself? I don't believe that you do it by looking at a macro level of Mork Borg and trying to make it into horror by building sympathy in any of the greater aspects, because they all are pretty horrible. But what you can do is you can go on the small scale. You can look for kindness in individual people. Not everybody in the world is probably going to be that horrible, or the entire thing would collapse under a wave of cannibalism and murder. No, you can find people who do have good intentions and show kindness from time to time. It's going to be even more rare if you are playing the world as it's written and the people are just horrible people in general. You can pluck an example out, show them to the characters, and maybe have the characters cling on to them, possibly first by being useful. Maybe they have a gift of healing. Maybe they can mend some of the grievous damage player characters might have. And that might give you an inroads for such a character. Maybe they've heard about a person who seems genuine and helpful. Maybe somebody who makes potions using their faith or using some artifact that is undeniably good. And then you threaten that character, or you threaten the artifact itself, to instill a sense of personal involvement with the characters. Now you have a shot at some real horror. The rest of it, all the trappings of horror are there, though. I mean, gruesome endings and terrible places, sure. Spend a camping weekend in the Valley of the Undead, and yeah, you're going to have some rough times there, no doubt. But in general, what you should try to do is kind of take these horrible characters. Everybody's characters are going to be pretty horrible people, unless, of course, they're interested in playing somebody who tries to rise above. The only one that I saw who really seemed to have potential to be good characters of the various classes, I think the Fallen Noble. Hey, Magic. The Fallen Noble could do that, and I think the Heretical Priest, if they're heretical against the Church of the Two-Headed Basilisks, might actually be somebody crying out in the wilderness for better ways, and maybe, trying to reach out to people and inspire their faith that things could get better. That could be used, although I don't really see it happening too often. There's just too much horror built into things, but you could make that approach and try to make good people out of the, frankly, again, just survivors in Morkborg. But you need some sort of an attachment. Then, of course, you need a threat. Now, if it's just a threat of casual violence, like the characters are going to be exposed to all the time in Morkborg, unless they find some place of safety and can cling to it, that's not real horror either. You know, if you know your major threat is that, okay, it's a gang. A gang threatens this poor woman who helps out the injured and tries to see good in other people and has helped the party before when they were grievously injured. And this gang is threatening her. That's more action, honestly. I mean, that's been the subject of any number of action movies, is some group of do-gooders finds a gang that's threatening the innocent and thrashes them soundly. I mean, you can even go all the way back to Police Academy 2 if you wanted to. But, yeah. But realistically, you should have something a bit more personal involved. Because, again, number one, it makes sense that the players are going to have a personal stake in it. And if it's something that is inherently dark, for instance, they don't just want to kill or do terrible things to this woman. They actually want to, say, rip her soul out and offer it to the basilisks. If the parties had any reason to have any kind of umbrage with the Church of the Two-Headed Basilisks, that may be a horrible fate, worse than just, we're going to take her because the basilisks want somebody. That's pretty dark stuff, and maybe that is the leverage that you can use the spur to get the players to care even more, because the fate is even darker. They need to take her someplace where they can extract her soul via a terrible ritual, and then capturing it, they would offer it to the basilisks. Those are the kind of elements. You need something that the players are going to fight against. Call of Cthulhu inherently does this, by the way. By having one of these uncaring elder gods who, if they appear, they're just by their very nature going to be horrible and destructive. That's a force that the players are constantly going to be fighting against by the prism of their servitors that are trying to bring them into the world or trying to use them to gain power or what have you. It is personal because they're threatening everything you know, potentially. So that already exists and is implied in, again, everything that you do. A Call of Cthulhu game is really effective, by the way, if, again, you take all of those elements of horror into account and you don't just have the players fighting for their own survival, but for things they care about, including the possibility of all that exists. Let's face it, we all have this understanding of Cthulhu rises, everything is done. You can't fight Cthulhu. You can't fight these elder gods. You have to stop them with everything that you can before the worst absolutely comes to pass. That is one of those things that is understood about a game like that, is that you're fighting not just existential dread, but the real possibility that everything ends, that you care about or that you know. And if it costs you your sanity, if it costs you your credibility, your freedom, things that you might actually sacrifice to try to save everything that you care about. And that is when horror makes sense. That's when these kind of games can be used to pluck at the heartstrings of the players, to cause them to beat a little bit faster, and to really spur their actions to stopping the horrible thing they see coming. That is really where horror can take place. Now, in that, there is room for all the other stuff, too. There is room for shock and gore. If you've ever played Resident Evil 7? 6? The one where you're in the creepy redneck house. And at various points, you see terrible things happen. And terrible things happen to your character, too. And you're exposed to this as a participant in the game. It's kind of even more so than watching it on the screen. It's happening to the character you're controlling, and it's going to have an extra level of shock to that. You can have things like that worked into the game too. For instance, in Harry Potter, sure. Book 6, Harry and Dumbledore are searching for a Horcrux. And they get to a point, Dumbledore recognizes a gate, and it can only be opened by blood. Harry has to stand there and watch Dumbledore, his mentor, his protector, slice himself open to put blood into the locking mechanism that will open to allow them passage. And, Dumbledore's like, oh, this is so primitive. This is so low class. But he does it, and you understand that it costs him to do this. And even though, okay, it's just a cut, why? Can't he cast a spell and fix that or something? No, that's not how it happens. Just wraps it up and moves on. Okay, fine. That has a kind of a horrific feel. I definitely was creeped out in that moment, and Rowling's writing isn't exactly the most terror-inspiring, but that moment was genuinely creepy. Personal mutilation, personal injury for the sake of having to get by something. That all fits actually fairly well with some of the inner sentiments with horror games, like Call of Cthulhu. What are you willing to sacrifice to accomplish your goals? And sometimes it may be horrible. Reading from a book that has got a good chance of claiming a part of your soul and driving you mad. Getting to a point where you almost feel like you have to do that, or leaving such a book around so that the temptation is always there to try to get by a scenario by drawing on dark power. That's a great element of horror. The temptation is a great element. The feeling of power when something horrible happens shouldn't happen. Like going into a frenzy in Vampire. You don't want to lose control of your character, but it is awfully affirming that your character is capable of some pretty awesome, if awful, things. You are the supreme hunter, and therefore your power over a common man is unmatched. And that's demonstrated when you go into one of these frenzies and wake up and you're in a room full of corpses and they've all been slaughtered by your powers going unleashed. You look and you've got all these wounds that you quickly heal, but there's plenty of blood, and you're like, oh, I'm walking out of the room and everybody around me was dead. That can be really affirming, even though it's also kind of horrible. So, horror is tough. Let's just kind of wrap this up and put a bow on it. Horror is tough. You need to try to develop things in horror to make it truly effective. You need, of course, to have attachments to characters. You need shades of gray and something that is something the players feel they can rally around, something that they can personally want to see survive intact. And if they can't, the thought is unthinkable. It's a worst case scenario, and they're fighting against that. One other thing that I'll throw out real quick, though, is the idea of, inevitability. Players really don't do well when they're fighting against something they truly feel is inevitable. So I wouldn't tug on that card too often. Prophecy and fate are often thrown around in games that, okay, well, it's prophesied at this point that something horrible is going to happen. Let the characters fight fate. Let them feel like they have a chance, because just going through the motions doesn't really feel the same. Unless, of course, your characters are incredibly personally motivated, and they're capable of taking a horrible situation, and they're capable of making something of that will basically demonstrate that they care, that they have some power, and that there's value in the struggle itself. That really is what a good horror movie is about. It's demonstrating that the good people rise up, and maybe they have a chance. They cling to those chances and they continue to struggle despite the fact that things look hopeless. If you make them truly hopeless, it's a downer, and they just did all of that for nothing. If it's possible to succeed, but at great cost, that's something to talk about. That's something to actually get behind, is reveling in the scars after a horrible conflict, a horrible struggle has been made. That can be incredible. incredibly affirming out of a horror role-playing game, a situation that looks absolutely terrible. So, just a few thoughts I've had, and hopefully, they stick with you if you try to do horror yourself. If you try to run a scary game for Halloween, it is something that really, really has a value to it, but it is so difficult, especially in familiar, comfortable environments where the players feel like they're safe and there's no real great surprises that can come off. Forming those bonds and threatening those bonds is a way that you can get around that comfort zone to some extent. So, hopefully this comes in handy for you, or at least gets you thinking about things like that the next time you contemplate something involving horror, and allows you to look at things that are labeled as horror and go, is it really though? Is it really? Or is it just edgy action adventure? So, thanks for joining me. I am OmnusI, and this has been my little treatise on making horror work in your role-playing games. Hopefully you tell many games, get to roll dice and have fun with friends and new acquaintances. And in this day and age, we need that more than ever. So, may Halloween treat you well. May you, have all the candy you can stomach, etc., etc. But enjoy it. So, thank you, one and all. I am OmnusI. This has been the Lair of OmnusI. Until next time, farewell.